Good morning and good afternoon to all these students available here to hear out this ATX InFocus webinar. That's the support for June 2024 exams. So welcome for this webinar, and my name is Richa and I work as Education Support Manager at ACCA. So as the title of this session suggests, manage your time, master your technique. So this session today is designed to support you with advanced taxation, where expert tutor Aileen Edgar will share her insights to help you with the preparations for June. So this webinar will focus on how to deal with case study based answers, lessons on time management, importance of question practice on practice platform, and the most important thing, the best practices during these final 3 weeks of your exams. So towards the end, we will be picking the questions which have been asked by the students in advance, and we'll try, and if the time permits, we will also be picking a few of them live. So before I hand over to Aileen, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. That's super quickly because I know many of you already know about this, but this I have to do as there may be new students as well. So there is help icon, which helps you with the resources and information to keep yourself connected during the session. There are icons on the slides and media player, so make sure that they are there with you during the webinar. And there is an attendee chat function which you can utilize to chat with your fellow webinar attendees, and that's the icon on the right side. But please be mindful, do not share your personal details there. There is a resource list icon, that is a file symbol. It contains all important links related to ATX paper, and please take a download of that. You can rearrange your screen to suit you and resize the windows if you need to. And at any point, if you are not able to hear or see any visuals, please do refresh your browser. Registering for this session, it means that you will be sent an email tomorrow with the details like how you can listen to it again. So don't worry, if you miss something in between, you will be able to access the recording. With this, I am going to hand over to Aileen in a moment, and we'll be back with you towards the end of the session. In meantime, if you want to ask ACCA or Aileen any question, then please put those questions in Q&A box only. So, and also note that we cannot guarantee responding to each questions, but definitely we believe that whatever we are able to share here will be helpful to everyone. So with this, handing over to you, Aileen.
Thank you, Richa. Welcome everybody to this session on how to manage your time in the exam and master your exam technique for the advanced tax exam. So I'm really glad so many of you are able to join us live today, as we're going to help you feel more confident in your exam technique and your time management in the ATX exam. So as said, my name's Aileen Edgar. I've been a tax tutor since 2008. I previously worked for both ACCA and ICAS, and I now run my own tax teaching and content expert business. I provide teaching, marking, tuition content, syllabus development, lots of other things to most of the professional accounting bodies in the UK, as well as a number of other learning providers. And so I have supported thousands of students through their studies over the years. And today I'm using that knowledge and experience to help you prepare for your June ATX exam. So in today's session, we're going to focus on time management and exam technique, particularly focusing on narrative questions, which students can sometimes find a bit more of a challenge in the ATX exam. Lots of you might have chosen ATX as an optional paper because you enjoyed doing tax at university, or you liked doing the TX paper with ACCA. But then you can get a surprise when you start seeing ATX past exam questions, and that there's actually a lot more emphasis on narrative points than calculations in some of the questions. You can absolutely get full requirements in the exam that are just calculation based, but more often we see requirements that are a mixture of calculations and narrative, or requirements that are completely narrative only. Now, most of you presumably like numbers, seeing as you're training to be accountants, so you might be struggling a little bit with the more wordy requirements and how to approach them. in order to maximise your marks, but minimise the time that you're spending on each question. So we're going to be looking at some tips and strategies to help you with this. Also, one of the key reasons students don't manage to pass this exam is due to time management issues in the exam. So I want to make sure that you're going away from this session today feeling confident in how you're going to approach your exam and what you can do if things aren't going to plan on the day. Now, throughout this session, you will hear me emphasise the importance of question practice. Exams at this kind of level just can't be passed by rote learning facts and rules. Yes, in ATX, we have so many rules, don't we? Dates, conditions to remember. So absolutely, you do need to know these, but it's no use having all that knowledge if you don't know which bits of knowledge are relevant to a particular requirement or what the examiner is asking you to do. Now, we'll also be going and giving you some practical and actionable steps to take in the last few weeks before your exam to get you prepared and using the time that you've got left the most effectively. Throughout the session today, for those of you who are on live on the webinar, please do start popping any questions you've got into the Q&A box for me. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the session, and I'll do my very best to cover as many questions as I can. So get your questions in early, increase your chances of me being able to answer them in the time that we've got available. You don't have to wait until the end in order to ask your question. So let's start then with how to approach questions in your ATX exam and some tips and tricks on those narrative style requirements. Now, I know nobody consciously plans to fail an exam, but there might be things that you're doing or not doing that are increasing the likelihood of a disappointing result for you. And one of those things that we see that's lacking all too often is planning. So I would recommend that you create a mini plan for every single requirement in the exam, even if it was only for 2 marks, say. Now, I don't personally copy and paste requirements into answer spaces when I'm working through a question. Rather, what I do is I actively pull out the relevant pieces of information and I type those into the word processing answer space. And that creates a plan for myself. And the reason I recommend doing this is that you're more likely to pay attention to the specific wording within the requirement. If you're just copying and pasting everything in, you haven't really learned anything about what you're actually being asked to do. So you could sit with your exhibit open and your word processing answer space open on your screen and type across the command words from the question. So whether it's calculate, explain, advise, and so on. And then things like I would note down if it's asking you to cover 2 or 3 specific tasks. Is it asking you to talk about advantages or disadvantages or to give a balanced viewpoint? If they're asking you to do a number of things within the requirement, I would actually pull those things out individually and create headings in my word processing answer space for those certain bits. So I'm leaving big blank spaces in between my headings, and that starts to give me a structure for my answer. And then while you're working through your plan, think about what type of response space is going to be most appropriate as well for your answer. So if it's just a calculate requirement, you can just use the spreadsheet answer space. If you're only being asked to explain, then the word processing answer space is going to be the most appropriate. Sometimes what you'll see is explain with supporting calculations. Have you seen that on questions? Now that would suggest that you should use a mixture between the word processing answer space and the spreadsheet answer space. Now, one of my favourite things to do, I don't know if that makes me a bit sad, but one of my favourite things to do when I'm looking through a new past paper question is to spot how the examiner has taken the time to write out the exhibits and the information in order to match as closely as they can with the requirements. I promise you that the examining team spend a long time trying to carefully word requirements and the information that they're giving you to make it as easy as they possibly can for you to navigate your way through and understand what's being asked of you. So I want you to start paying attention to headings, subheadings that are being used in exhibits and in the detailed requirement exhibit as well. You can use these to help you structure your answer, but also help you to navigate your way through sometimes what can feel like a really overwhelming amount of information. So I thought it would be useful, because I've kind of talked about how I plan, to show you how I write my plans for questions. Now, don't worry too much about the detail on this slide. This is taken from a mock paper, and in the top left-hand corner, we've got the detailed requirements for an 8-mark requirement. In the bottom right-hand corner, we've got my plan that I created when I was reading the requirement, and also some of the information in the relevant exhibit for this one. So don't worry about reading the detail here. It's more about spotting what I'm doing when I'm planning, and that I haven't just copied and pasted that requirement out into my answer space. I'm doing a much more active planning and read through. So rather than copying and pasting it all, I start by pulling out the key command words from the requirement, and I've put them in capital letters to make them stand out more. So you can see where I've said compare, comment, explain. I've made that really clear for myself, because it's really important for you to remember those words that you are being asked. That helps you know how much detail to go into. If it says briefly explain, then you know you don't give much detail. If it says state, there's no explanations needed. If it says calculate, you know you need to do some calculations. It's really important to notice this. Now, there are other techniques you can use. You can use the highlighting function within the exam software, and you can highlight those words. There's different colors you can use as well, so you can use different colors for different things. I do it this way because it's very active. I'm physically typing out these words, and because I'm physically typing them out, that is starting to process in my brain rather than passively just colouring things in or reading. So I've got my command words in capital letters on different lines. I'm setting them out because I'm thinking, okay, this looks like I've got 3 different things to do here, really, doesn't it? I've got to compare something, I've got to make some comments on something, and I've got to do some explanations on something else. So can you see that my answer is starting to form a bit of a structure? Because this particular requirement in the top left, and you don't need to worry about the specifics of it, but there's a lot going on there, isn't there? There's a lot of information. There's numbers, there's bullet points, there's dates, it's talking about different strategies. It's a lot. And so by spending a bit more time planning and reading through it carefully and actively pulling things out of that, I think that you're going to be able to write a much better answer in the time that you've got available. So in this particular requirement, I had to compare a price to some post-tax proceeds, and I had to comment on factors that would negate or limit a financial advantage of a particular strategy. And I had to explain what relief options would be available for a trading loss. And had I just copied and pasted that into my word processing answer space, I would still be none the wiser as to what I've actually to do. But by actually sitting and taking the time to read the requirements carefully and pulling out the key words, I now have a better understanding of the 3 main things that I have to do. And I've started to give myself a structure, as I said. If there are 3 things I've got to do, it would make sense if I created 3 headings using these mini requirements. And so I've underlined those bits in red, and that's really for your purposes in today's session, so you can kind of see clearly we've got 3 things there. You could number them in your word processing answer space, or you can just have them really clearly on separate lines. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you how my answer to this uses those 3 things to create headings and then create my structure. So by doing this, by spending, this has taken me 1-2 minutes to do, a couple of minutes, let's say, to do this. But by doing this process, I've taken an 8-mark requirement, and I'm now thinking, okay, I've got 2 or 3 marks per sub requirement probably. So what might have felt like quite an overwhelming task with lots of information and numbers and dates has already started to calm down a bit. Now, you might not be able to do one of these bits And now you realise and you think, oh, I can't remember. But maybe it'll come to you, so don't panic. But by splitting this down into 3 different things you have to do, I hope you can see that you should never give up. You shouldn't read something and go, oh, it's too much, it's overwhelming, I don't know this. Because actually in here, there are going to be things that you can do. And I know some of you are going to be resitters and you've maybe failed previously by only a couple of marks. And just think, if you could sort planning, time management, and just realise that some of the requirements that maybe you felt you couldn't give a good go at, you actually could have if you'd spent a wee bit more time planning and just spotted that there's actually a few different things to be done. Maybe you can do 1 or 2 of those. Maybe you can't do all 3, but if you can do 2 out of the 3 things, you're going to pick up the majority of the marks for that requirement. Okay, so that's another really, really big benefit of spending time planning. The other thing that I've done is I've created some bullet points. See at the top here of my plan, I've got some bullet points. And I've just pulled in there just useful bits of information as I've been reading through the sort of bigger scenario that you can't see on this slide, but the bigger scenario behind the question, any kind of key things that I think, oh, I think that's important, better put that down, or I'm going to forget this, I'll put that down. It's not repeating, it's not copying and pasting, it's pulling out information and physically typing it in. And again, that's just getting my brain so focused on this requirement and what I'm being asked to do. Okay, so in this question, there was a little note, another thing just to point out, under one of the sub-requirements, and it said, for the purposes of our calculations, we should ignore indexation allowance. And so I've written that as one of my bullet points as well. Because I know that once I get going into a capital gains, a chargeable gains calculation, I'm likely to get carried away and I'm going to forget what the requirement told me to do. And so by actively writing that out for myself in my plan, I'm much more likely to remember that. And also it's easier for me now to go back. Once I've done my answer, I can go back and check this little mini plan that I've done. And if I spot something on my mini plan that I've forgotten to do, or I've done but I shouldn't have done, I've got time to go and fix it, potentially at that point. Another really useful thing about spending time planning, trying to create these little headings, is about, spotting things that you're going to find harder. It's going to help you manage your time. So like I was saying, if you spot something you think, oh, I don't know how to do that, if you split it out, you can manage your time around that and go, okay, I'm pretty confident with the first 2 bits there. The third bit, not sure, maybe it'll come to me. But what you can do is you can take your time allocation for the requirement and almost split it up even further and then go, well, I'm not going to spend the whole 18, 19 minutes on this 8 marks. I'm going to give myself 12, 15 minutes maybe. And if I haven't had a light bulb moment, I don't know what I'm doing with that third part, okay, I need to leave it there. I'm going to move on to another requirement, knowing that I've still got a couple of minutes in the bag that I can use somewhere else if need be, or I can come back to it at some point. So don't give up. Start with your plan, start with your structure, and by going through a plan and thinking about how the requirement splits down into these little step-by-step tasks, you might find there's bits that you're more comfortable with and you can have a go at. So in this particular requirement, for example, that third part explaining what relief was available for trading loss, that was actually about anti-avoidance legislation around the use of losses, where we've got a company that's been taken over, and then there's a major change in the nature and conduct of its trade. So that means the loss actually cannot be used going forward. Now, even if you didn't know what to do with the first part, maybe to do with post-tax proceeds, or about the financial advantage of option A, which is the second part, you could still have actually had a chance of picking up a couple of marks for the third part. And that's better than nothing. That's better than just deciding it's too complicated, I don't know what to do, and I don't know how to get started. Okay, so here on this slide then, this is how I turned my plan into an actual answer. Now, I know there's a lot of text on this slide. Don't feel that you're having to read all of this. I want you to look at the presentation of it. Do you see how my plan, which pulled out the relevant bits of the requirements, has now turned into this well-structured and flowing answer. I'd pulled out that there were 3 main things to do, and therefore I've got 3 headings that correspond with those 3 things. For the first sub-requirement, I'd planned in my plan that I'd need to do a comparison of figures. And therefore, what I've done up here, where I've got this cross-referencing note here, it says, see spreadsheet. I've signposted my marker to go and look at the spreadsheet for the figures. And then I've given some narrative explanation in the word processing answer space underneath it. Also, notice how I'm writing. Short paragraphs, lots of white space in between my points. Now, your marker is going to take the time to read every single thing you've written. Please don't worry about that. But the way that I've presented my answer is actually more for my benefit than it is for my marker. And the reason that I'm able to write such short sentences is because I've spent time planning in the first place. If I know what I'm going to write and the way I'm going to write it and the purpose of what I'm writing before I start, then I'm much more likely to be succinct and clear and move quickly through each requirement. But it does take practice, okay? This is not something that just comes naturally to everybody at all. It does take practice. So later on, I'm going to suggest something that you can do to help you get better at doing this yourself. Okay, so I wanted to finish off this section just by giving you some tips around writing answers for the ATX exam. So firstly, it is absolutely okay to be blunt with your answers. You're not writing a university essay here. You are trying to be clear and concise. Quite often you're going to be given figures in a question, as you would expect for a tax paper. But even where the requirement appears to be purely narrative in nature, if you've just been given some figures in the scenario, you should be looking to pull them into your answer somewhere. It could just be as basic as pointing out that a client is a higher rate taxpayer because their salary is £90,000, say, or that a company is expected to be loss-making in the future. There's always a reason why the examiner has chosen to give you some information. You want to avoid giving answers that could just be copied and pasted into an answer for some other client. We don't want cookie cutter answers. We want answers to be specific to the client and their situation. So hopefully I convinced you about creating mini plans for each requirement, but what you also need to make sure you're doing as you're working through your answer is actually check back to that mini plan on a frequent basis. Make sure you're not going off on a tangent and that you're still on track. When you're doing calculations in your answers, please make sure your workings are clear for your marker to follow. You can absolutely put formula in the cells within the spreadsheet answer space. Your marker can see those. But I would just give you a word of caution with that for ATX. If you were to put a long string of formula into one cell, if you've made a mistake somewhere with a bracket or a percentage or a decimal place, for example, it can become quite difficult for your marker to pick through what you're trying to do. And they're trying to make sure that they give you as much credit as possible. So I would recommend, for example, if you're doing a capital allowances computation, that you're showing the tax rate that you're applying. So the marker can easily see what you're trying to do. So show that on the face of your calculation rather than being hidden in a cell. Same goes for other calculations like inheritance tax. If you're applying certain reliefs or exemptions, get into the habit of actually writing them out, because not only does it make it less likely you're going to make a mistake in trying to take a shortcut with a formula, but also makes it easier to do a quick review for yourself of your answer and make sure you haven't forgotten to apply a particular exemption if you can see it on the face of the computation. Another tip on structure and how to approach answering questions in this exam is to use specific dates. I see this all the time with students. If you are asked to explain certain claims that can be made, as well as explaining how they operate, make sure you actually use an actual date. And that includes the day, the month, and the year. Why? Because your client does not have a clue what you mean if you say something is due, oh, it's the first anniversary of the 31st of January following the end of the tax year. They have not got a clue what that means. But if you give them a specific date, they understand. And your marker is looking for, not only do you understand there's a rule here, but you understand how it applies to this particular client, okay? So dates, we need day, month, and year, okay, to make sure you're maximizing your marks. And if you've told the marker what the rule is, they can see, oh, they understand the rule, but there's no proof that they can apply it to the dates and figures in this question. I can't give them full marks, okay? Now I want to talk to you about your time management. One of the biggest reasons people might struggle with this exam. Let's think first of all how ideally you want to think about timings going into your exam. So it's a 3-hour, 15-minute exam. And the recommendation is that you spend around 90 minutes on question 1, which is a 50-mark question, and spend 45 minutes each on questions 2 and 3, which are 25-mark questions. Now, hopefully you already know there are 80 technical marks in the exam, and there's 20 professional marks. And what you need to be focusing on in the exam is getting those technical marks. Although you'll be told in the question what categories the professional marks have been given for, you'll have no way of knowing the specific criteria being looked for by the marker. So there's no point in you spending any time in the exam worrying about what those criteria specifically are. What you should be doing is making sure that you're writing in the format you've been asked to do so, for example, a memo or an email, and that you're answering exactly what has been asked, and also spotting anything that's missing or might give some value to your client, such as reliefs or exemptions. So you're going to be focusing your time in the exam on the 80 technical marks. Now there's 40 of those in question 1 and 20 of those in each of questions 2 and 3. So you want to leave yourself 15 minutes to play with. Then that would work out to be 2.25 minutes per mark, per technical mark. If you find it easier to think of as 2.4 minutes, that's absolutely fine as well. That would pretty much use up the whole of the 3 hours and 15 minutes if you were to do that. Okay, so 2.25 minutes per mark, technical mark, if you're wanting to have 15 minutes to play with. 2.4 minutes per mark if you find that easier, but it will use up the whole of the 3 hours and 15 minutes pretty much. Now, in terms of the potentially spare 15 minutes, initially that was given in the exam in order for candidates to spend time reading and planning before they started writing their answer. And although that 15 minutes is added into the time that you can now spend answering, it's still recommended that you spend 15 minutes planning and reading. Now, what I think I would do with that 15 minutes, I would spend it on question 1, because question 1 is the question that's going to have more exhibits to read through, more scenarios to work with, tends to have requirements that are a little bit more detailed. So my approach, and I've seen this work with most of my students, is start with section B in the exam, which is the 225 mark questions, making sure you stick as closely to the 45 minutes for each of those as you can. And then I would look at section A question, knowing I had a 15-minute buffer and that I can spend a little bit longer on each of the requirements there, reading the scenario in order to understand what I'm doing. But the best recommendation I can actually give you for this is for you to practice yourself with different approaches, because we're not all the same. Find out what works for you. Some people prefer to do section A question first because otherwise it's on their mind the whole of the exam and they're worried about what might be in there. Some people prefer to skim through each of the questions and see what the topics are and then pick the question they feel most comfortable with, or indeed that they feel least comfortable with. So I actually would recommend that you spend time when you're doing any mock exams or past paper question practice, experiment with attempting the questions and just use different orders. Experiment with using that spare 15 minutes reading time. See what seems to work best for you. Now, once you've started your exam, you need to make sure you keep moving. It's one of the most important things of all, even above your understanding of any of the technical topics. You can write a fantastic answer to question 2 and 3, but if you've run out of time for most of question 1, you've just made it really difficult for you to pass that exam. And even within the questions, remember there's all sorts of different requirements. And again, if you don't stick to your timing for each individual requirement and you end up running out of time to answer all of the requirements within a question, again, you're just making it really difficult to pass. There are going to be requirements that you're more comfortable with. That's normal. but you want to make sure that you're at least writing something for each requirement. But you must move on once the time that you have allocated for that requirement is up. But there's no point pretending that things always go well and nerves can take over. We can have moments of panic. And I even know some students end up daydreaming during an exam, although I personally can't imagine ever feeling like I'm in a dream during an exam, but I do know students that happens to them. So what should you be doing if you start to feel that things are going wrong? Well, this actually happened to me in my very final accounting exam. I knew halfway through that I was failing, and I just went into a spiral of panic. And I ended up essentially making my worst fear come true because I just wasn't able to complete the exam because I was so stressed and so panicked. So I did fail it. And I had to pull myself back up from that and approach my reset with a totally different attitude, and having done a lot more question practice and a lot of reflection on my approach to exams. And I had to make sure that when I was in the exam the next time, that if I felt things were falling away from me, that I was able to take back control of that and change the outcome. So I promise you, if I can do it, I know that you could do it as well. So some of the bits of advice are not what we would say you should do from the outset in your exam to save yourself time. So please be clear about that. These are things that you can look to if your time management goes awry and you know you're not going to be able to give the required amount to each requirement with what you've got left. So although you should avoid bullet points generally speaking in your answers, if you're running out of time, it is absolutely okay just to start getting bullet points down, short sentences, key phrases that you think are really important to get across to your marker. Also with advanced tax, a lot of students get really hung up on making sure they get to the end of, say, a capital allowances computation or an income tax computation. But in actual fact, there's seldom any marks for the very final last figure on any computation. The marks are actually all throughout the computation for every decision that you're making about a rate to use, a threshold to apply, whether to add something or deduct it. Every time you make a decision, you're picking up half a mark or a mark. So please don't feel like you have to overrun on your time in order to get that last line down. Of course, it is ideal if you can do it, but if you're running out of time or likely to miss out on other marks, then you really do need to focus on where the marks are likely to be. If you find you're spending too long deliberating over whether you should add something back or deduct it, or whether something should be taxed at 19% or 25%, you need to weigh up how many marks you think that particular decision is worth. How much time are you spending debating it? Remember, markers use an own figure rule when they're marking, and so they're only going to penalise you once for making a mistake. So say you applied a capital allowance rate of 18% instead of 6%. You lose the half mark there, but whatever number you've arrived at, if you then use that number correctly somewhere else, you'll get the credit for it. Often there are marks in the advanced tax exam for stating conditions that apply rate reliefs. So even if you're running out of time and you don't know how to actually do the whole computation, or you don't have time to do a whole computation, you can state some of those key components that you'd include in your computation. You might pick up some marks there. Another question I get asked is, if I'm running out of time, should I worry about professional marks over technical marks? So that's thinking about your kind of layouts in question 1 particularly. So question 1 is the only question that has marks for communication. And even at that, just because you don't finish a particular computation or you don't write in full sentences for 1 or 2 requirements when you're clearly running out of time, it doesn't mean you're going to miss out on the professional marks in full. But even if you did, you've got to weigh up how many professional marks are there really here for my presentation and communication style versus the technical marks that you could be picking up by writing in a more sort of shorthand way. So ideally, we'd love it if you can manage your time perfectly, of course. But hopefully, that's given you some tools to have handy in case things go a little bit wrong in the exam and helps you to pick up some valuable marks or helps you get back on track with your timing during the exam. Now, this section, we want to talk about question practice. It's so incredibly important for this exam. I hope you know that already. No matter how unready you feel, you really have to push yourself to try questions without notes and without peeking at the solution as much as you can. We're now too close to the exam to be kind of hiding away from it and being shy. So if you haven't already started doing question practice from past exams, you have to start now. As you're going through the questions, I want you to be spending as much time reviewing your answers as you actually spend doing them. There's so much you can learn from looking at a model solution and thinking, well, why did they put that point in and I didn't? Or why have they not mentioned this particular issue where I had it in my answer? Normally, you can figure this out by going back and reading the scenario and the requirement again more carefully than perhaps you were able to do first time round. Quite often I'll get students asking me about, why wasn't this annual exemption applied in the answer? I deducted it. And without even looking at the particular question they're speaking about, I normally know that the answer is going to be, it told you in the scenario somewhere that the person had already used up their annual exemption for that year. So spend time going back through your scenarios and requirements. Look for clues and hints and steers. I promise you they are there. Now, another really useful thing to do is actually going back and redoing questions that you've already had a go at. It's not cheating, I promise. It's actually a really effective way to help your brain to rewire and respond differently to that question in the future if something similar came up. If you just look at a solution and tell yourself, oh, I knew that and I'll do that next time, I'm afraid the likelihood is you'll do it exactly the same way that you did it the first time around, because that's the way your brain remembers. If you physically go through the motions of redoing a question, but with the correct approach, you're not only helping that set of rules stick in your head, but you're also training that muscle memory to act differently in the exam when the topic comes up. Now, one of the questions I get as well is, how on earth do we remember all the rules for ATX? It's just too much. And yes, it's an absolutely massive syllabus. And there's so many rules, conditions, etc. So yeah, you do need to have a really good memory recall for some of the areas of the syllabus, because if you don't know what the conditions are for a business asset disposal relief, for example, you just can't apply the rules to questions. But memorizing the conditions just isn't enough for this exam. You need to be practicing applying that knowledge to multi-topic scenarios, and that's why past paper question practice is so useful. One of my top tips for you is to start using the practice platform for question practice if you aren't already using it. If you're using pen and paper or Word and Excel, now is the time to stop doing that and move over to the blank workspace on the practice platform. You can have a PDF of an exam question on the screen, open up the blank workspace on another window and work between the two. Or if you're using hard copy questions, you can sit with them beside you and have the blank workspace open across the whole of your screen. If you want to be getting used to the functionality within the exam software. You want to get used to where the tax tables are in the exam. You want to be putting yourself in a situation as close to the real exam and what it'll feel like. And we're now seeing some strong statistics coming through that students who are using the practice platform and not, they're having a positive impact on their performance in the exams. So really make sure that you start using it if you aren't already. On the practice platform, you're going to find the pre-mock available for you to do and mark yourself. You'll also find a specimen paper, a couple of practice papers, and all of these have been updated to Finance Act 23. So you know you're working on the most up-to-date questions and aren't going to come across anything that's going to confuse you with syllabus changes that we've seen each year. So, question for you then, I'd love to know how many of you are using the practice platform at the moment, specifically for advanced tax. I want to know. You might have used it for other subjects. I want to know if you're using it for advanced tax. Just there should be a little poll on your screen. Just click yes, no, sometimes. I want to kind of get an idea on this. Okay, so we've got some answers coming in. So if you just click yes, no, sometimes, be honest, can't tell who said what, doesn't matter. Let's see where we're at with that. Okay. Oh, very evenly split, isn't it? So there's a lot of people who do not practice questions on the practice platform, and that has to change. You have to change that. If there's one thing that you do between now and the exam, I want that to be it, that you start practicing questions on the practice platform. Okay, blank workspace. And practice them on there. Okay. The rest of you who are using it, well done. Keep doing that. You are doing yourself a favour, I promise you. Okay, before we move on to the Q&A session, I just want to give you some tips for the last 3 weeks until the exam, so that you know where to focus your energies in order to maximise your chances of a good, solid pass in this exam. So one of the most commonly asked questions, and I've not looked at the Q&A box yet, but somebody might have asked this question, is what topic should I focus on in order to pass this exam? I am afraid that absolutely nobody can tell you what's going to come up in the exam, or even what is due to come up, as I sometimes hear people saying. The ATX exam is a multi-topic exam, and it's designed to replicate real life as a tax advisor. You've got a client comes to you with a number of different issues. So you need to be prepared for considering more than one tax at a time. You cannot question spot. There are no indications as to what might come up. For your TX exam, we always knew you'd get 15 marks in income tax, 15 marks on corporation tax in the longer questions in section C. Advanced tax exam, we don't have any indicators like that. And not only is the whole of the ATX syllabus examinable, but so is the whole of the TX syllabus. And quite often in a requirement, we'll see some marks from assumed knowledge from TX and then some marks that are from new topics from ATX. Sometimes we also get requirements that are purely based on assumed knowledge. So you've really got to make sure you're confident in the foundations. Now, I have listed out a few ideas of topics you need to be comfortable with for this exam, but please do not in any way, shape or form take this as a definitive list or any kind of hint. I'm confident that you'll see something around overseas transactions or residence issues, but that could be from the perspective of an individual company. Could be to do with income tax, VAT. We quite often do see something in the exam around an unincorporated business, but again, it could come from lots of different angles, losses, taking on a new employee, business structure, that type of thing. Capital gains tax reliefs, definitely popular. You know that there's lots of different ones, so you need to be confident in the conditions and be able to spot them. We do see capital gains tax and inheritance tax being examined in the same question quite often because they are taxes that apply to the same kind of transaction. For companies, yeah, we see lots of losses, group situations, but you could also see a question around maybe a close company situation, and they're focusing on both corporation tax and income tax implications together. I'm afraid you have to expect the unexpected, but with good planning and question practice, you can feel confident that you can deal with anything that they throw at you. So top areas of focus other than the syllabus for you then, make sure you spend time familiarising yourself with the content of the tax tables. You might already have been using these, but if you've been referring to notes or materials, now make sure you're focusing on tax tables to help you answer questions. Know where to find them in the exam. They're in the bottom left-hand corner, normally in the help little bit. You might already have had a look at the technical articles on the website, ACCA website. If you haven't read them yet or not done them recently, do make sure you go back and look at them again. There's also some topic explainer videos available, which are nice and short for you to review. And definitely look at the technical articles and explainer videos for TX as well as ATX. So you know you should be doing lots of question practice in the run-up to the exam. The planning, I hope I've convinced you that planning is worth doing, but make sure you start practicing that now. You can't expect to just go into an exam and know how to plan effectively if you haven't practiced. While you're doing question practice, start writing down answers and reviewing solutions. And while you're doing that, jot down anything where you're making mistakes over and over again or you're missing things. And a really useful thing to do with the planning that I said I would tell you about is actually spend time only planning. Don't worry about answering questions. Just pick a few past paper questions and just go, all I'm going to do is plan. I'm going to read requirements, plan the answers, bullet points, a wee bit like I did, or whatever style suits you best, and then check to the solution. Does your plan match the solution? Are you on the right lines? If you're not, go back and read the requirement again. You must have missed something. And yes, doing a mock. Somebody was asking, is it still worth doing a mock? Yes, 100%. It is still worth doing a mock between now and the exam. Yes, it's one of the best things you can do, I promise you. But you need to spend a good amount of time reviewing it as well. So speaking of mocks, ACCA have prepared a mock exam for you on the practice platform before your June exam. Comes with some debrief videos focusing on exam technique, etc., and some of the trickier elements. Here's a little poll for you. Do you know the dates for the release of the mock and also the video debriefs that go along with it? Let's see if people know. There should be a little poll on your screen. Just hit the answer that you think is the right one, or your understanding of it anyway. And let's see who is right. Okay. So the mock itself is already available on the practice platform. The debrief videos are coming out tomorrow, so most of you know that, so that's good. Well done. Yes, so the mock is already available. Practice platform, debrief videos are coming out tomorrow. Make sure that you've actually had a go at the mock before you look at the videos. You'll get the most out of it that way. Okay, so questions. There's been loads of questions coming into the Q&A, so I am going to look through those. We did have people submit some questions in advance, so I'll cover off those just now, and then I'll get through as many questions as I possibly can from the ones that you're very kindly popping in there for me. So we had a question about how many sentences or paragraphs to write 2 marks. Now, there's no set formula for advanced tax. But as a good rule of thumb, I would say if it's a narrative answer, I would expect to see 2 long sentences for 2 marks. But your sentence can't be just repeating information from the question. That's not going to get you marks. It needs to be applying the information. So from one of the questions that we did earlier, if I give you an example, I'll read out a sentence to you. I would expect this to get 1 mark. The trading loss cannot be shared with any company in the group as advised. Therefore, it would be carried forward to use against Delimited's future total profits. I would expect that to get 1 mark. I mean, it might get 2, but it seems unlikely. I think that would get 1 mark. I'm making 2 points really there. I'm stating that the trading loss can't be shared with any company in the group. And then I'm saying, therefore, this is what will happen. So it's 1 sentence, but it's quite a long sentence. It's got 2 main points in it. So I'd expect half a mark for each of those points as a general rule of thumb. Somebody else saying, many years since you passed tax. Yep, this is very common. For very common people have exemptions, or it's been a while since they've done TX. Between now and the exam, you need to make sure that you've got solid foundations of your assumed knowledge. But with the limited time that you've got available now, the best thing you can do is start with question practice, past paper question practice, and from that, learn which bits of the TX syllabus that you're not as comfortable with. You don't have time now to go and relearn the whole of TX. So I would read all the TX technical articles. I would start with question practice, and from that, create that little watch out list of mistakes you're making and use that to see what kind of things are coming up that I don't know how to deal with, and it's assumed knowledge, and then go back. You've got the access to the ACCA study hub. You can go into the TX one and you can find the relevant bits there. So that's what I would say to that one. How can you pass ATX with 1 month to go? Now, I don't know who asked this question. It was submitted in advance. I hope that this person had already started studying and that they weren't just starting fresh. ATX, as you know, is a massive syllabus. It's not for the faint-hearted. It does take time. It takes a lot of understanding of the rules and then application with question practice. So hopefully that person had already made a start, and the things to focus on that we've talked about in the last few slides with what to do with 3 weeks to go, hopefully that will help focus your attention. Is domicile and remittance basis, will it be tested in the exam? Well, nobody knows if it will, for definite, but it is definitely examinable. And I would say that overseas issues, they're new at advanced tax in a more detailed way. So you'll have done some of it in your previous tax studies, but we learn much more about it at advanced tax. And it's something they can apply to individuals and companies. It applies across different taxes, so it's very easy to get it in anywhere across the exam. So nobody knows if it will, for sure, but it is definitely an area you want to make sure you're comfortable with in the exam. Okay, so I'm just going to have a quick look in the Q&A box, and I'm going to pull out some of the questions, see if there's any common themes as well. Okay. Okay, so there was a question about how do I use marks available to get an idea of how much detail to use. So I hope when I was going through showing you my plan and how I took an 8-mark requirement and I broke it down into 3 bits, and then I kind of made a judgment of, well, you're not going to know for sure, but let's just say it's like 2 marks each, 2 to 3 marks each. And then that helps you to split out as well. So I hope that helped. Yes, there'll be a recording available of this session after today. Yep. You'll get the link sent out to you. Oh, are there any small specific areas of the syllabus that are worth some extra attention? Oh, yeah. There's always something that is in the paper that is not obscure, because everything's examinable in equal measure. But there's things you go, oh, that was oof. And you kind of feel the student's pain when you hear that that's what was in. But I tend to think of these things as prize winner marks. And I see that sometimes with past paper questions. I go, oh, that's a prize winner point. You know, hardly anyone's going to get that point, but somebody will. And I guess you need to go into the exam going, I need 50%, ideally more, but I need 50%. I don't need to know everything about everything. I need to know enough about every area. And the most important things are how you apply that knowledge to your answer. So, yeah, I think with a small amount of time left, you need to focus on the sort of main areas of each tax, the main rules of each tax, the main conditions for each relief. You are going to forget a few things around the edges, but remember there's half marks all over the place in the answer. So you can still pick up answers and marks even if you don't know. Somebody was asking about the professional marks. So you're not going to worry about them, like I said, you're not going to worry about them in the exam. But if you write your answer in a way that's planned, careful, does exactly what you've been asked to do. So if you're only asked to calculate, you only calculated. If you spot reliefs that apply, because quite often they're not obvious, if you spot reliefs that apply, if you give people good advice, if you make a balanced recommendation when asked, these are the types of things that contribute towards the professional marks, but it's not something you can really spend any time worrying about in the exam itself. Somebody's asking, what past year questions should you review? Yeah, because there are some available that go really far back. I would focus on the most up-to-date ones like this new mock and the specimen and practice papers, and then work your way back from them. That way you're less likely to come across any issues with syllabus coverage. You'll also see the right style of exam with the professional marks now in 3 questions rather than the 4 questions we used to have. And also just the style of presentation now for the exams has a slightly different presentation in terms of it always gives you this little summary at the beginning of the sort of main topics that the client is asking for advice on. And that's been a change in the last year or so. So you want to stick with the most recent ones that you can. And as I say, even redoing questions you've already done is a really useful thing to do if it's one that you struggled with. Somebody's asking, should you answer the question in past tense or future tense? I think that's what you're meaning. Sorry if I've misunderstood your question. So it doesn't really matter. I would take my steer from the question. If you're being asked, if you're told your client is planning on bringing a partner into the business, you know, I would talk in future tense. So if you do this, then this will happen, because it's not happened yet. So it always gives you a date at the top of the exam. It's normally the exam date itself, but it says assume today's date is whatever. And if it doesn't say that, just assume whatever day you're doing your exam, that's the date you're in. And you can use that, so you can tell if somebody's giving you past profit information or they're giving you forecasted. Just take your lead from that as to whether you're talking about things that have happened or things that will potentially happen. Okay, just looking to see if you do have any other questions, please do. We've got a couple of minutes. Quickly pop them in and I might be able to get a chance for questions. Okay. I don't see anything else we've not talked about. Oh, somebody wanted me to go back to another slide. You'll get the slides, you'll get a copy of the recording and everything after, and there's a resources box you can get access to other links and things that you need. I'm just seeing some questions looking for where they can get access to various resources. Oh, any final words of reassurance for nervous people? It's really tough if exam nerves are a real issue for you. I want you to spend some time thinking about breathing, fresh air. It's different for everybody. For me, I had a little poem that I read before I went in. I stopped looking at notes, the poem, and I just read it over and over again, and it calmed me. Breathing techniques, look up some of those. They can really help you in the exam as well. But the planning stuff that I was saying at the beginning, I think that really helps. But you have to practice it. You have to practice it between now and the exam. But it helps. It gives you something to do rather than worrying about all of the exam. You start to laser focus down into little bits at a time. Say, if you are nervous, I would probably recommend starting with section B, because those have less information to read, and I think students find them less kind of overwhelming to look at initially. Okay, I think I've covered off everything. Oh, right, one last question. If I perform calculations and I provide answers in the same spreadsheet instead of cross-referencing, is that okay? As long as you've got your which requirement it is that you're answering, so your marker can tell one bit from the next, that's okay. If there is some narrative explanation, you'd be better having that in the word processing answer space. There's also a little table function within the word processing answer space you can use for short calculations as well, just to keep them neat, is worth having a look at too. I think that is everything that I am equipped to answer. I just keep seeing ones and I keep wanting to answer. Do you read the scenario and exhibits first, or do you read the requirements first? Good question. So there's always going to be this kind of main screen of information where they list out the main things that you're being asked to do and tell you a wee bit about the client. Read that first, sets the scene. Then I would go and open the detailed requirements exhibit. It's normally, so there's one called requirements, but it doesn't have much information in it usually. So click on that and have a look. But there's probably one of the other exhibits has got detailed work to be carried out, and it'll say exhibit 3 or something like that. I would go and read those first before I read all the scenario, because you need to know what it is you're being asked to do before you start reading. Otherwise, the reading is completely passive. It's meaningless. You have no idea what to do with any of that information. You can't plan anything because you don't know what you're actually being asked to do with that information. So that was a really good question. I just wanted to make sure I answered that one before we finish up. So that's 10 o'clock UK time. So thank you, everybody. I'll hand back to Risha now.
Thank you so much, Aileen. I think you have really done wonderful in terms of the questions, and quite many of them have already been covered so far in having them recording them in advance or if they are coming live. So that's really great. I just want to answer one question. There was a student who was mentioning that the answer of June mock is not available in the practice platform. So just let me tell you that when you complete the mock for ATX, then post that you will have to you submit it properly, go to the marking section, mark section, and then when you will looking into that, there are two options onto the right hand side of your screen, that is question marking guidelines, and the another is question sample answer. So sample answers are available there, so please complete your mock first, then look into the sample answer so that you will be able to understand where you went wrong. And also the debrief videos, as you already know through the poll, they are coming up tomorrow. So that's it. That's great. And just I need to bring things to a close. All the resources are there in the resource section. Do take all the links either right now or later on whenever you are watching it on demand. And with this, all big thanks to Aileen, to my team at the back end supporting us with Q&A and technical things, and big thanks to all the students. Best of luck for your exam preparation, and many best wishes for your exams. With this, thank you so much, everyone.